My name is Ken Weston. I am a senior security analyst with Tripwire. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon. I wanted to thank you guys for having me out here. This is great. I've been on a bit of a tour. I was in Texas, actually, at a panel talking about SCADA security. And then I'm heading up to Sector next to talk about cyber stalking. So this is kind of a stop in between. I'm going to be talking today about point of sale to point of fail. So talking about sort of the rash of retail breaches that we've seen over the last few years. Talk about how this actually came to be, and then also offer some guidance as to what we can do to actually stop at least these types of breaches. So again, my name is Ken Weston. I do work out of Portland. I work a lot with customers. I look at emerging threats. We have a lot of large retail customers. Actually, with a lot of these breaches that were actually occurring, we actually had one customer that was using our tools, and we actually were able to detect that before those credit cards were exfiltrated. And that focused to go look at them and ask, how did you guys do this with our tools? And through that, we were able to create additional tools to help mitigate some of these risks, particularly when it comes to the new point of sale malware with memory scraping, things like that. We're dealing with very sophisticated types of tools that we haven't really seen before. And a lot of retailers were sort of dumbfounded as to how they actually can block this type of attack. And actually, the technologies have existed for a long time to actually block these types of attacks. The problem is it's very expensive as it requires major hardware refreshes, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Previously to Tripwire, I developed a number of tools to sort of use malware to recover stolen devices and solve other crimes. I've been involved with a number of cases. I probably put several dozen people in prison for stealing devices or child pornography or other things and other investigations I've been part of. So I'm very interested particularly in how criminals actually do what they do, and that's what I'll kind of walk through here. So if we actually look at the evolution of cybercrime, it actually follows the evolution of money. If we actually sort of look at how our money has evolved, really we shouldn't be surprised that hackers or criminals are targeting point-of-sale systems, because that's where the money is. As we've evolved, the US dollar became a point of currency, became a fiat currency. Most transactions, most money is now digital in some format, be it through credit card transactions. We're also seeing cryptocurrency, and the sort of pseudo-anonymity that Bitcoin actually provides has actually helped fuel some of the elements of cybercrime, which I'll talk about a little bit. Talk about underground markets, hidden services, and things like that that are helping to really fuel this. And so I got a quick trivia question for you. Who is this? You guys, anyone know? All right, I'm going to give you a hint. It's Black Bart, also known as Charles Bolton. So Black Bart was known for robbing stagecoaches. He was on the East Coast. He went out to California to join the gold rush. He wanted to make his riches. When he got there, he was very disillusioned with it. He had a lot of issues. He wasn't able to make a lot of money. He had actually left his family as well to come out and strike it rich. And he became very frustrated with Wells Fargo for whatever reason. He also was very well versed in how they actually operated. And from that, he was actually able to find a way to actually get his gold. He actually was a mountaineer. He knew how the mountains, he knew the terrain, and so he knew points where he could actually stop these stagecoaches and actually rob them of the gold. Why go and mine the gold when you can just steal it from these stagecoaches? He was sort of an early hacker in many respects, because what he would actually do is he was very nice to the people that he was robbing. He would actually put gun barrels in bushes so that the people would think that there's additional people that were part of his gang, when in reality it was just him. So in many respects, when we look at some of these retail breaches, this, I believe, is just a continuation of this. It's just human instincts, I believe. It's human nature, particularly when money is involved. And I actually went back and I looked at Wells Fargo. They actually had a corporate report where they actually looked at the actual cost of these stagecoach breaches. So if we actually look, the actual total losses of theft were around $415,000. But if you actually look at the actual rewards they paid, which were a percentage of the actual what was stolen, they had to pay a bounty for every one of those. So lawmen, they didn't just have a salary, they actually got paid for when they actually captured these guys. There were attorney fees, other expenses, and there's also the salary of some guards that they had that were up on the stagecoaches. So the actual cost of going after these guys and in the security was actually more than the actual losses themselves. Does that sound familiar? If we look at retail right now, that was one of the driving forces behind this, is that a lot of the retailers, they didn't see that there was added value in actually securing that information. And that created this sort of insecure environment that allowed hackers to thrive. And you'll see here that train robberies were a little bit lower, right? So they went from stagecoaches to trains, because that's what they started migrating to. As the railroads started getting built, they stopped relying on stagecoaches. It's a lot harder to rob a moving train. It's a lot harder to stop it. Some people did, but it was a lot more dangerous. We're talking about the ROI, increasing the ROI for the attacker, making it more difficult for them to actually get at the goods. It's going to be increased risks. There's more risk of them getting caught, killed, or just stopping a speeding train is pretty difficult, and it requires a large group of people to do. The more people are involved, the more likely you're going to get caught. So now we look at some of the retailers that were hit recently, and there's quite a few big ones. I mean, we've all seen Target, Home Depot, a number of retailers were hit from big and small. And it seems like every month there's additional retailers that are actually still getting hit. So how is this? Wouldn't we have learned, right? These retailers got hit, hey, we're going to go change our infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not so easy. A lot of these payment systems and payment gateways that have been set up require a massive financial resources, hardware refreshes, and also a lot of these retailers are actually focused now on the EMV conversion. So that's a big requirement. Unfortunately, the EMV requirement isn't going to make the credit card situation go away. It actually doesn't increase the security in any way. I will show how it decreases the demand for stolen credit cards, but it's not going to make those credit cards more secure. So we even saw that the DHS actually, or the US CERT actually sent out a number of alerts to retailers, and it's really interesting when the US CERT start getting involved and they start actually talking to these retailers that you need to start securing your stuff. The Secret Service in particular has access to information around fraudulent credit cards. They're able to actually detect these breaches usually before the retailers do, and basically it's from identifying patterns of fraud from the transactions, right? They're able to identify sort of the single point of commonality of where these transactions occurred, and then they're able to identify not only what retailer was hit, they can narrow it down specifically to what store, and even in some cases what specific system. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works further down the road. So we have PCI DSS, right? So that's going to save us from all these breaches. Unfortunately, what we've actually seen is even if PCI DSS comes out with the different versions, the number of breaches are actually increasing. So PCI DSS, it's a checkbox. Basically, when we talk about compliance, that's something that we have to do, whereas security is something that we should do. So there's a big differentiator there. And unfortunately, when we talk to people that are executives or people that are on boards, the first thing they say is like, well, we're in compliance with PCI DSS. What's the problem? Why aren't we secure? And that's a real problem I'm finding, particularly with executives, explaining them the difference between compliance and security. So EMV is going to save us, right? Not quite. Here's actual statistics around EMV when it was actually deployed in Europe. Sure, when it was adopted, the amount of credit card fraud went down. However, it increased because the hackers found a way around it. They found that they could actually steal these credit cards and they could use them in different countries because these other countries didn't have EMV. And what happens when you have a credit card that doesn't support EMV? Goes back to the mag strip, right? So they were able to do that. And then the credit card processor had to initiate other things around fraud to try to block some of that. But still, they have this sort of cat and mouse game when it comes to the credit card fraud. What it's done is actually it's decreased the actual value of the credit cards, but it hasn't necessarily decreased the amount of credit cards that are out there. The types of credit card fraud is very different. They can't go out and create counterfeit cards as easily. It requires a little extra work. However, online fraud and things like that, that is still going to become a problem. So sort of understanding the underlying sort of economy of how hackers work. So this is sort of a rough example. When the credit cards were stolen from Target, it's usually a criminal syndicate or a group. Now, that's specifically what they do. They're targeting credit cards. They will then sell those to a carder. So carders deal in, there's forums, there's a number of these hidden services or hidden markets on Tor. Well, they'll actually sell the credit card numbers to lower level actors who are the carders. The carders, what they'll do is they'll try to turn those credit cards into, for example, a prepaid credit card, or then they'll transfer that into an Amazon gift card. So why do they go through all these different steps? The reason is because it takes a long time for these credit card companies and people like Amazon to catch up to what actually has happened. By the time they've actually figured out that, hey, this prepaid credit card was purchased with this stolen credit card, and then that went to this Amazon, there's a whole process that has to occur. And it can be anywhere from several weeks to several months before that is actually unveiled. So the retailers like Amazon, the guys who are selling the prepaid credit cards, they actually lose a lot of money. Of course, it's all, they get it back on insurance. Those credit cards are then used to buy goods. So they'll buy them on Amazon. They'll then ship those to someone who's sometimes a mule. This is a whole other realm of fraud where these fraudsters will target maybe a stay-at-home mom or someone who wants to work from home. All you have to do is you're going to be a shipping associate. And what we're going to do is we're going to send all these packages to you, and either they're going to send them directly to another customer who's already purchased them through an underground market, or they'll ship them up into a big box and they're going to ship off a bunch of stolen goods like phones and things like that outside the country. And the problem with this too is that the police they figure this out. They go to this house. These people basically they're committing crimes and they're not aware of it, and sometimes they can even have a felony now on their record as a result of that. And that's just goes to show that this isn't just about stolen credit cards. There's an entire underlying economy and a process that this all goes through. So if we actually look at some of the underground markets, there's a lot of services and tools that are actually available. You have your initial access tools, so deliver payloads, automate exploitation. You'll have exploit kits in 0 days. Black POS, for example, was being sold for around $2,000 before it was sort of made open source in the underground community because there's a whole drama around that. So there's also payload parts and features. So you can actually pay people to customize that for a specific environment. So people think, the hackers, it's like one guy in someone's basement. No, this is a very organized criminal group. They're highly organized, highly specialized. If anything, they actually reflect a very well-run business in many respects. So you also will have people that have a botnet or packers, cryptors. It's not uncommon for them to run it's like a denial of service attack against infrastructure to distract an IT team before they actually go in and target a point of sale system, for example. You'll also have additional payloads that'll have malicious behavior, focus on destruction, denial, degradation, and deception. There's a number of botnets that are out there actually available for lease or sale. We've seen these used by these groups for exfiltration of the credit card data once they've actually gotten it. It's very difficult then for law enforcement to trace where that went. So, where mostly stolen credit cards go? Do you guys know? What country? Boom. All right, you guys are good. So yeah, there's also enabling of services. So there's groups that will actually assist in finding the targets, finding vulnerable hosts. And what's really important too is that there's groups that they know how these systems operate. Sometimes they may even enlist people that worked in IT or ask someone that worked in IT in some of these companies some questions about how they're structured. One thing I found too when I was doing research is that some of these retailers were doing case studies with very well-known security vendors or point-of-sale systems, and then it would be very easy to identify specifically what systems they have in their environments. I've even seen some cases where they actually have full network architectural diagrams in the case studies of how the network is structured and how great this point-of-sale system works. And that's a bad idea. If you work work for a company and you have a security vendor that wants you to do a case study, be very suspect of that. Do it anonymously, or ensure that your security team actually has a chance to audit that document, because you can actually be exposing a lot of information. I work for a security company, and that's something I even advise to our customers. Even sometimes the marketing groups gets a little excited about a case study. Just given the nature of our business, I feel it's more responsible to focus on their security. So when we actually look at the credit cards, a lot of these ones from Target, if we look at like Brian Krebs, he did a lot of research on this. It ended up in one specific market. You're looking at about 2.8 million credit card numbers at about $8 to $20 each. And these credit cards have a half-life. As soon as that's been disclosed that they're part of a breach, the banks are going to shut them down pretty quickly. So these guys have to operate rather quickly. Usually within 2 to 3 weeks, those credit cards are no longer valid. I also found a lot of other places to buy credit cards, not necessarily from mega breaches. Actually, there's ones that you can go and a lot of times in restaurants, sometimes a waiter, he'll have a little side business, or sometimes you'll see it at gas stations as well with skimmers. They'll actually store, a few hundred credit cards, but then they'll be able to sell those to people on the black market. They're not going to become millionaires, but it's a little extra money in your pocket, so it's just something to be aware of. They'll also target smaller retailers, particularly that were looking at remote desktop. We actually saw, like in the Northwest around Seattle, Dairy Queen was hit, and it was through a particular payment processor that wasn't secure in their infrastructure properly. They wanted to provide remote access to the service provider and some of the IT folks in the organization, but they didn't provide two-factor authentication, and the password was really easy to brute force. And I'll kind of show some examples of that. And so if you want to look, there's tons of onion sites out there where you can buy these stolen credit cards. Be careful about creating some of these accounts. If you're in the security industry, you can go out and look at them, but don't purchase anything from these websites, even if you're tempted to. There is a record of that, and you basically are committing a crime. So when we actually look at some of these underground markets, you have people that are sort of general members, it's sort of this pyramid. You have mules that can be, they can be aware that they're committing a crime or unaware, like with the repacking fraud, for example. And they're sort of lower level. And then you have sort of the vendors and the brokers. So people that are actually the carders, they're creating the forums, they're actually selling these credit cards. And then you have the people that are more specialized. They're writing the exploits, the malware devs. And what's really interesting about this is that the further you move up the food chain, the more money's being made, the further you're getting away from the actual crime. So when we talk about a lot of the stuff, these guys are actually basically operating with impunity in Russia and Eastern Europe. The FBI and law enforcement have a lot of information. They know who these guys are, but the problem is there's not a lot of collaboration with law enforcement on the other side. And that's sort of helping to fuel this as well. So, hackers have, there's a lot of job security right now in insecurity. If you actually look at the process that we're actually implementing for EMV, for example, EMV, we've already passed the deadline, right? So everybody has their chip and pin, right? Everyone's got their chip and pin card. Right. So it's still going to take the retailers at least another 2 years, I believe, before we're actually going to have chip and pin. And Canada, Europe, they've had this for years. It's really amazing how long it's really taken us to get there. And this is actually helping to drive this as well. Why go target Europe or whatever when the U.S. is still an easy target? So in many respects, we've made ourselves an easy target. I keep saying target, sorry. So here's an actual photo of some machinery that was actually picked up from a group that was actually making fraudulent credit cards. It's making the fraudulent credit cards. It's not easy. It actually requires a lot of machinery and a high level of sophistication. People always think that these people that steal identities, they're all tweakers and things like that. Not necessarily. It's a very well organized group, and the machines that they have at their disposal are actually quite expensive. Just to give you guys an example. You have your card encoder. Those aren't so hard to get. I buy them on Amazon. I actually have one myself where we actually create a demo where we actually do a RAM scraping demo, and I run it on my computer. Getting a skimmer as well or an encoder that actually write the information to the mag strip. The technology is incredibly old, and there's machines out there that you can do it just off your computer. Then you have the embossing machine, and that makes those cards look a little bit more legitimate. My credit union, they give me a new debit card. I get a new card every 3 to 6 months just because I'm paranoid. But now they've gotten to the point where they don't even emboss their cards. There's just a flat card, and it has the mag strip on it, and that's it. Then you have the tipping machine, and those are a little expensive, but that's what's actually going to put the nice little foil on it. So if you're going to be in the creating fraudulent credit cards, and you really want to show your customers that you're primo, make sure you get a tipping machine. Make sure you have that magnetic foil in there to really make it look realistic. And again, you can buy these credit card encoders on Amazon. You can buy them even on other sites. You get the encoders as well. You can get them for anywhere between $10 for a reader, $150 for an encoder. And then if you look in underground markets too, you'll find that there's a lot of stolen goods that are out there really cheap. They're brand new, like a new iPhone or an iMac that maybe you want to get for someone for Christmas. The holidays are coming up. There's these carding stores, and basically these are goods that have been acquired through that process I was talking about, where you get the prepaid cards, and then you get the Amazon gift card, and then they get the goods that are then shipped overseas, or it could be shipped from someone else's house as well in the U.S. But you can go and you can get an iPhone for half price, and it's brand new. This is to help drive a lot of the demand for these stolen credit cards. So people that are actually buying these stolen goods, they're involved in this process as well. So what's interesting is that when you actually look at some of these breaches, it takes around 200 days before an actual intrusion is detected, if it's detected at all. A large number of the retailers that have been hit, they didn't detect that they were breached. They were told that they were breached because the credit card numbers were discovered through the fraudulent transactions. So in some cases, they may discover it in 200 days, but a lot can happen in 200 days. There's a lot of fraud that can take place. If you don't have the right tools in place to actually detect a breach, you're going to be in trouble, because what's going to happen is you're going to be notified in one of two ways. You're going to be, Mr. Krebs he has a connection to a lot of bank fraud managers that actually disclose some of this information when there is a breach. There's a number of tools out there, and there's one I'll talk about here in a bit that can provide, or service provider that can actually tell a retailer if they've been breached, if their credit card numbers are out there in the wild. And also the Secret Service. They have access to this information. They have a direct funnel from the banks and the transactions where they can actually identify the fraudulent transactions. Then you might find out that you've been breached because the CEO calls you in and wants to know why your company is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Right? That seems to be when the executives really seem to care, is when there's some sort of impact to the brand, and no one wants to be in that situation. When we see Target, for example, basically it was a complete disruption of the entire C-suite. People lost their jobs, right? And now finally, executives and boards are actually paying attention to this. Retailers, mega retailers in particular, they're actually focusing a lot more on security. But unfortunately, it takes mega breaches like this for them to actually to move. So how do we actually detect, that there's been a breach? If we don't have the tools in place, we can't detect that there's been a breach in our environment. So how is it that the Secret Service or bank fraud managers actually identify it, that there's been a compromise? So normally what happens is when there's around 2% of the credit cards that are out there will actually be used in a fraudulent transaction. So people are shopping at your local grocery store. In general, 2% of those transactions, those credit card numbers, will be found at some point to be fraudulent. So that's sort of the background noise. That's sort of where we have established our baseline. Once they start to see that number rises to, it's all right. to like 5%, then things start to get a little suspicious. When it gets up to 10%, Houston, we have a problem. 25%, we've been breached. Something's happened here. This is when you're going to get the call from the Secret Service or someone on Krebs' side. He'll notify him that there's some sort of anomalous activity happening here. So the way this works is if we look at a map, down here in the corner here, let's say there's all these transactions that are happening. If all of a sudden they start to see that there's a lot of fraudulent transactions, usually in another state or another area of the country, those are all going to throw a bunch of red flags. And this process can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months. If we actually look at the actual credit card transactions, fraudulent credit card transactions by region, this is a really great map. This was actually given to me by a group called Rippleshot, and they actually have access to this information. They're actually able to identify, you can actually, as a retailer, you can subscribe to their service, and they will actually tell you before the Secret Service does or Krebs, that, yeah, you guys have a problem. We're seeing stolen credit cards, that came from your store, and you need to do something about it. What's really neat is I got to look at some of their technology. Not only are they able to tell you specifically what retailer, they'll tell you what store, even to what system specifically was actually compromised. So that can be a nice thing. You've already been breached. Maybe you'll get a week or two headway before this actually gets announced out into the press. So this is an actual losses associated with one of the, I won't say which one, but one of the mega retailer breaches. Before there was actually any indication that they were breached or any notification, there were roughly $2 billion worth of transactions that actually occurred with those credit cards. So who pays for that? Like $2 billion, right? They just write that off. No, we all pay for that because we get increased credit card fees and transactions. The retailers have to increase their prices as well. So there's a lot of money that's being lost as a result of this. And we as taxpayers as well will pay for that. So then we want to know, how are these retailers actually being hacked? The first one is RDP, so remote desktop. This is low-hanging fruit for a lot of hackers. I actually run a quick scan, and within about 10 seconds, I found just randomly about 1,200 systems with open RDP ports. And you can scan the entire internet within a few hours. I turned this off quickly because I didn't want to piss anyone off. But everyone is basically being scanned all the time. I mean, we know that if anyone has IDS, you're looking at your logs, you put a system up and you're immediately scanned, within 10 minutes. They're always looking for open ports like this. And with RDP, it's really easy to do brute force because there's some issues around that. So bad passwords are really bad. A lot of the smaller retailers in particular are very guilty of this. They won't have a good password. They won't have account lockout. It's not enabled by default for remote desktop. It is an option, but most people don't have that enabled. There's also two-factor authentication. It requires additional third-party tools to actually implement that. Again, that's going to be a cost. It's going to be an inconvenience. Why bother? And then there's this tool here. It actually will brute force. If you find an open RDP port, it'll brute force it. It's pretty powerful. It actually will find a password rather quickly. And then I actually found, when I was dinking around in these underground markets, I actually found a number of RDP accounts that were actually for sale in these underground markets. So if you're lazy, you don't want to do the scans, you don't want to do the brute force yourself, again, there are services you can go out and find that for. And some of these guys will even do the work for you. They'll even tell you what retailer it is. They'll gather all the information for you and then basically just hand you the keys to the kingdom. Again, you can then also hire someone to write the malware for you to compromise those systems. Usually these RDP systems, when people RDP into it, they're going to be used for command and control, use them to be part of a botnet, to do distributed denial of service attacks, things like that. But a lot of times they'll go in and they'll find that this is actually a point of sale system, and then it's just a bonus at that point. So then if we actually look at the kill chain and actually how these these criminals actually function. From what I found, they do a lot of research on the organization before they even touch the network. They do a lot of passive reconnaissance. I got permission from one customer to actually do something similar, where the whole thing was I'm not allowed to touch the network at all. I started with infrastructure, just doing some things for like DNS, things like that. And then I got really creative and I started mining social profiles. LinkedIn is awesome. If you want to know what kind of technology a company has, look at their job postings, mine their LinkedIn profiles of their system administrators. I was able to get a lot of information. I actually gave them about a 200-page report of all the information I found, and scared the crap out of them. They're like, well, how'd you know this? We say you're not allowed to touch the network. And I'm like, well, you have a bunch of people actually in your company that are looking for jobs. I didn't reach out to them directly, but I could get more information from them. But I was able to go through their profiles and identify what they specialize in. It's very simple from there. So they do a lot of research, not just on the employees and the infrastructure. They'll do a lot on understanding who your business partners are. Some of these environments are very secure, and so sometimes the best way in is through a trusted partner. We saw this with Target, right? So through their HVAC vendor, no, they didn't go into the HVAC system, not any sort of like a Mission Impossible thing through the vents. What they did was they gave them access to a billing system, and it just happened to be that they didn't segment some of their network properly. So by the hackers actually getting access to those credentials and logging into the billing system, they were able to get into the payment systems and the point of sale devices as well. So. And also, they'll still rely on good old exploits. So there's always vulnerabilities within your infrastructure. We do a lot with vulnerability management. Sometimes a lot of companies, even small companies, they think, yeah, we ran our vulnerability scan. We ran Nessus about 6 months ago. Didn't find anything. A lot changes in 6 months. A lot changes within 2 hours. Especially nowadays when we start seeing zero-day vulnerabilities like Heartbleed, things like that. They're popping up pretty regularly. Sorry. I should have got some water. So always be on the lookout for that as well. So once they actually get in, it can be through a remote desktop, it can be through a phishing campaign, through a trusted business partner, or an exploit. They're going to get inside, and the first thing they're going to start doing is identifying vulnerabilities within the network. A lot of times people focus a lot on securing their perimeter, not so much when they get in the inside. It's sort of like an orange. It's like maybe a little bit harder on the outside, but once you get inside, it's nice and soft and squishy. They're going to target and they're going to look for critical assets. Things they want to target are going to be Active Directory, any sort of network applications, and then a patch server. For example, in some of the breaches we've seen, they've actually targeted the patch server that the point of sale systems were actually getting their firmware from. So you don't need to go out and compromise each one of those individual point of sale systems. All you need to do is compromise the patch system. You get your firmware, which in there with some malware on it, and you can easily and quickly deploy that, not just to a few point of sale systems. A lot of these have a centralized system where they'll have one data center that all the stores will then go to and download the firmware to a server on that in the store, and then from there, around 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, then they'll actually deploy that out to the systems. And this whole process is automated. And there's some stuff around signatures and things like that, but it's pretty easy to spoof. But there's no sort of manual process that's in there. There's no one really observing that process as it occurs, particularly around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's what we've seen with some of these mega retailer breaches, where they're actually able to very easily deploy their point-of-sale malware to these devices. From there, they're able to exfiltrate credit card data, depending on the type of malware. I'll kind of go through some details here shortly. But then they're able to exfiltrate those credit cards. They'll usually then load it to another server that they've compromised in the environment. And then very carefully, they will exfiltrate that out through a series of different servers to sort of hide their tracks. And once this happens, once the cards have been exfiltrated from the organization, that's the point of no return. Once they've left the building, you've been breached. And you either didn't have the tools in place to detect that something was going wrong, or you're going to hear about this from the Secret Service or Mr. Krebs. So when we want to look at some attack vectors for these point-of-sale systems, so even a system or an environment that's fully compliant with PCI DSS, there's still weak points. So kind of going back to Black Bart, right? He knew how the systems operated. Oh, thank you so much. Just a second, sorry. So he knew where those systems operated, and he knew where to stop those stagecoaches where he wouldn't get caught, where they were isolated and alone. And it's the same thing when we talk about hacking point of sale. There's places within these environments where we can actually get and grab credit card information, particularly because most of the retailers in the US haven't focused on point-to-point encryption, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. With Target, the US stores were hit. Did you know there's also Target in Canada? And they weren't hit. Do you guys know why? They had point-to-point encryption installed on those devices, so the malware in that particular case wouldn't function properly. So I'm not saying you're going to be 100% secure, but you're going to increase the risk and the cost of the attacker to go after that type of environment. So if we actually look specifically, the data in memory, that's where the point-of-sale malware is really targeted and is where it's really thrived in all these mega retail breaches. A lot of these organizations, they'll encrypt information between the device and maybe a payment gateway. A lot of times they actually won't have the information encrypted within the store and the environment, which I'll talk about as well. But even if they are encrypting that information, you can still easily extract that out of RAM. And if we look at some of the versions of the point-of-sale malware, there's a number of them out there. They've evolved. They become more sophisticated over time. The most popular one's been Black POS, and there's even more sophisticated versions like Lucy POS. There's even versions that open up Tor connections. There's all sorts of really interesting things that they're actually doing with this malware. Sometimes I'm just sort of amazed at how technical some of these guys are. It's pretty amazing, some of this malware that they've actually written. So if we actually look at the point of sale of the weak points, the places we want to look for credit card information if you're an attacker is going to be on the network, in RAM, or on the disk. Those are the three core places we want to look. So I find a lot of organizations they won't encrypt the credit card information within the organization. And PCI DSS did not require that. What they required was you to encrypt the credit card information between the merchant and the actual payment processor. Within that environment, you can still not encrypt it, have credit cards in plain text, and you're fully compliant. So again, compliance doesn't mean security. As an attacker, it's very easy to go in and sniff that network traffic if I get in. I don't even have to install malware. There's a number of tools I can actually get access to that are actually on some of these servers, or I can actually sniff some of this information, look for that credit card information, and exfiltrate it very easily. There's a number of pieces of malware that will also look for that on the network. They'll look for any sort of credit card, anything that looks like a credit card information. It'll write it out to a file, and then exfiltrate that from the organization. But then we want to get more sophisticated, right? So some of these organizations, they're actually encrypting that data. So RAM scraping is the next way to go. And the way it works is, credit card gets swiped. That credit card number is actually put in memory before it's even transmitted or encrypted anywhere. You can see here, sorry, it's kind of tiny, but you can see where the actual credit card number is actually in there. It's really easy actually to grab. And then we can go in and we can then download that to a file. I've actually, we did a demo where we actually have some sort of point-of-sale malware that we worked on in-house, and we have a demo. If you guys are interested, I'm more than happy to share that with you. I didn't put it up on a public website, but we have one for looking at credit cards in RAM, credit card on the network as well as on disk. So they're just sort of little utilities you can run on a simulated point-of-sale device. If anyone works in retail and you want to scare the crap out of your boss, your executives to show how easy it is, it's a really good way to do it. Sometimes just actually showing the real demo and how it works is something that kind of gets your point across a little better than just simply saying you don't want to be the next target. And then from there, we want to exfiltrate the data to a remote server. So, what can we do to mitigate some of these, the point-of-sale malware? So when we look at security control responsibility for PCI DSS, a lot of it, is with the merchant. However, when we actually look at things like point-of-sale, like the RAM scraping malware, in reality, there wasn't really any way for retailers to identify that that was happening. And so that really isn't covered under PCI DSS. Sorry, it's really tiny. Can you guys read that? But I'll share my slides here. But if you actually look at data in transit, the local communication, communication between the devices and the point of sale system, these are not mandatory. And then communication to processors, there's a requirement to encrypt information between the store and then the actual payment processor, but not within the store itself. This is evolving, PCI is trying to catch up, but it seems like every time, for how long it takes to get, new requirements around PCI, the hackers are already like 10 steps ahead. As we've seen, as the PCI has evolved, we've actually seen an increase in retail breaches. And then if we actually look at the environments, when we actually look at the kill chain like we had before, the first thing people should be doing is, hardening your configurations, assess your perimeter for vulnerabilities. Again, don't just run vulnerability scans. You actually need a full vulnerability management solution. There's a number of commercial products out there. You can, jerry-rig something using open source, but it needs to be a continuous process where you're constantly monitoring for those vulnerabilities. Identify and prioritize and remediate those vulnerabilities quickly. That's a big problem for a lot of organizations, is actually the workflow around how to actually go out and remediate those vulnerabilities. I see a number of organizations that get reports from a third party that they paid for. Here's all the vulnerabilities, go fix it. And they don't really know which ones to fix first. And then we want to go in through and continue to monitor for file changes. We want to identify any sort of internal indicators of compromise. There's like file hashes, things like that for malware. Usually if you start seeing that your systems are communicating with an IP address it hasn't communicated with before, that might be an indicator as well. If you actually start seeing credit cards in your environment, you should be sniffing for that. If you actually see credit cards that are being transmitted across the network in plain text or otherwise, you want to be able to identify that as well. You also want to look for sort of large files that are being created on a server, for example. It may be a big encrypted blob. That may be the only thing that you see that's actually any sort of indicator that you've been compromised. Some of these hackers are becoming more sophisticated. They're not just storing the credit cards in a plain text file. They're actually encrypting it so that so they don't get detected. Another is to focus on the network function and segmentation of the payment systems. A number of retailers, they'll actually have their payment systems on the same network as the rest of the business. Luckily, most retailers have gotten smart now and they're segmenting their networks. But I swear, sometimes you find one system that's on both and you just slap your forehead, or shake your head, wonder why. And then, of course, a good thing that really focus on is point-to-point encryption. This is very different from end-to-end encryption. Point-to-point encryption will actually encrypt information, the credit card data actually in memory. So even if they do exfiltrate that with point-of-sale malware, they still don't have any use for it. I am seeing a possibility for some malware to circumvent some of that, but it's actually finding vulnerabilities in some of the point-to-point endpoint software. So it's not as easy to implement as some of the other attacks. So focusing more on the point-to-point encryption, I think, is going to go a long ways in actually protecting these organizations. We're seeing a lot of retailers that are actually doing that. But the problem with this is that there's a high cost to do this. They have to rip out all the existing hardware, all the backend has to be overworked. I was thinking, we have to change our hardware for EMV anyway, so wouldn't it be a good idea to sort of, kill two birds with one stone? Unfortunately, not a lot of organizations are that savvy. They're going to do EMV first. They're going to wait and see how that goes, and then they're going to look at actually deploying point-to-point encryption. And it's going to take a long time for us to actually see that sort of migration actually occur. Also, focus better on endpoint monitoring as well as what's happening on the network. You don't want to monitor for anything that looks like a credit card on the file system or even an encrypted blob. You want to look for any new binaries or change configuration files. Simple endpoint detection of detecting new binaries or configuration change, that would have actually stopped a lot of these breaches. But a lot of these folks, they weren't actually monitoring those point-of-sale endpoints. And that's been a challenge because some of these systems, they can't really have a full-fledged agent that are running on them because of system requirements. Tripwire does have one, just saying. Sorry. That just paid for my trip here, thanks. But there are other tools out there that are focusing more on the point of sale. And they're getting more sophisticated too, not just monitoring things for change, configuration changes, things like that, but actually looking at processes, which is really, really slick. And there's even things we'll actually automate. If there's something strange, it'll automatically do a dump of memory, and you can send that out to your incident response team. So the more you can automate that process and the monitoring of those endpoints, the more secure you're going to be. EMV, I think it's a great shift. I think it's going to be a good thing for the industry, but it's important to realize that it doesn't actually provide security for any sort of online transactions. So credit cards can still be used fraudulently online. Luckily, some of the fraud protections there are becoming more sophisticated as well. I have a lot of friends that are in the industry. EMV, it does not actually still require data encryption, so it's still good to utilize the point-to-point encryption in those environments. EMV cards, they still have the mag strip for fallback processing, so that could be an attack too, is like compromise a system so that the chip and pin doesn't work and it defaults back to the mag strip. So they're not going to shut a store down because the chip and pin doesn't work. If they have to do mag strip, they will. So just something to think about if you're an attacker. The card data can still be stolen. EMV vulnerabilities, they're going to be exploited. There have been some security research around this already, targeting some of those systems. Again, it's going to be more around vulnerabilities in the endpoint software in particular, but it's just something to be aware of, that even when you deploy these systems, you still have to monitor those systems for vulnerabilities and ensure that you have a patching system in process in your processes. It's going to decrease the value of credit card data. It's going to decrease the demand for it, but it's not going to impact the supply. Still going to be very easy to still steal that credit card information, particularly from some of these organizations that aren't encrypting it. I did a joint webcast with my friend Slava Gomzin. We've done a lot of stuff on retail at Tripwire. I actually was able to get a sample chapter. It's actually the best chapter of the entire book. It's amazing. It's payment application architecture and vulnerabilities. Sorry about the tiny URL. There's a QR code if you trust me. So feel free to download that. Sorry, you have to fill out like a lead form, put gibberish information in there. Don't tell marketing I said that. But download that, and it's a really good intro into some of the challenges of securing these environments and what retailers can do to actually protect themselves. And with that, I guess I have a little bit of time for questions, but I'm not sure if you guys have any. I'm also going to be here for the next few days, so if you want, come and talk to me. We're happy to. Yeah. Yeah, that's like a whole nother presentation, but so I used to work for a company called Iovation, and that's what they focused on, and a lot of that was, a lot of this gets put on the merchants themselves, and so they actually lose a lot of money from that, and so they actually have this really intelligent system where they do like device identification. They're able to see that, hey, this system has been known to deal in stolen credit cards, things like that. There was actually just an issue with Vistaprint. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. There was a bunch of like wire fraud scams that were coming out of it because they were offering like a free month of service, a free website. So you could register a domain, you can get a free website, free email. And so people were registering similar domains to other companies, and then they'd be sending these very sophisticated phishing emails to, hey, this is Julie from accounting. Can you wire this money to this account for paying this bill? And it was all using stolen credit cards. And it was because Vistaprint was not requiring the security code, and they weren't even requiring the expiration. So these guys would get like basically 30 days before they would even figure out that this was a stolen credit card. You already still have the domain registered, so you still have the domain for another 2 months. So you can do this whole sophisticated scam. But once they actually started getting this fraud, then they actually implemented some of those security controls. But still, people are still using that free 30-day window, just it's not as easy. But there's all sorts of scams like that, but it's usually going to be more on the retailer themselves that are going to be implementing some of these fraud protection technologies. I see a lot of times for stolen credit cards too, these guys that are selling the stolen credit cards are really focused on customer service. They want you to succeed in your fraud, and so what they'll do is they'll actually give you proxies as well. So, a lot of fraud detection, they'll actually say, hey, that credit card number, you're not in Oregon. And so what they'll actually give you is like, this credit card belongs to someone that was stolen in Oregon. Here's their address, and here's a proxy in Oregon, so that it looks like you're actually doing that transaction from Oregon. And if that credit card doesn't work, they're going to give you a new credit card number with another proxy. So they're going to make sure that you succeed. So customer service is number one in underground markets. Okay. Yeah, in the back. It's both. So I've seen it in both cases. So the initial versions are, it does have a binary, and it does have a signature, and it does modify some of the system configurations. But I am starting to see some that runs directly in RAM. And actually, just the other day, I talked to a security researcher group, and they were actually creating malware on the fly from existing code that's running on the system. So, these guys are brilliant. They're out of University of Texas, really smart guys. So I'm guessing that we'll see this in the criminal underground, probably within the next year or so. So the tools you actually have deployed, think about what access they have. If they're running as root, sysadmin, things like that. Even security tools themselves will become targets for some of this malware. So just something to consider. Yes? Not so much. I think I haven't seen any malware that's been targeting them in particular. Like most of those are running on iPads, things like that. I haven't really seen too many. The scams I have seen are people that are running those off of separate skimmers, or they'll store the card numbers, on a file system or something like that. But that's usually a smaller type of scam. It's very similar to what you'll see in a restaurant when the waiter takes the card and he goes and swipes it on his own skimmer. But those are the only types of systems I've actually seen that on so far. But I don't know if anyone else has seen anything like that. I'd be happy to talk to you. I'd be curious about that. Yeah, in the back.
You talked about like dark sites and Tor. How much information are the people that steal the information giving? Like, are they giving like IP addresses, blocks, or company names for free? And can you just start scraping those, or have you seen companies scraping those and trying to fix things before?
Yeah, it varies. Most of the time it's going to be bulk data, but there are specialized guides you can actually go to where, it's sort of like how you can get fulls. You know guys what fulls are? Like when you get the full identity of someone, not just a credit card number, also their address, things like that. It can be also the same thing for a company where there's all sorts of data that's out there that's been breached in these underground markets, and some of these guys will be sort of brokers in the local and say, yeah, we're targeting this one company, hey, or this IP range, do you have any, can you go out and find this information for us? So there's sort of like the research librarian that you have, like in college, things like that, that help you do your research. There's groups of people that will actually help you conduct that reconnaissance and then provide those reports for you. A lot of the bank fraud managers are actually buying stolen credit cards in some of these underground markets. They'll buy them in batches and just to see, what store that's coming from. So they are, they're not buying a lot of them, but they're buying enough to get a sample to identify a potential breach. And they are getting more savvy, and they are monitoring some of these groups, Secret Service as well, and they're looking for some of that information. But the problem with that is that these services get spun up. They come down. The average life for some of these marketplaces anywhere from a couple of months to a few weeks. So, yes.
You talked a lot about chip and PIN. I have a chip and signature card, I guess most of us here have. Have you heard anything about them moving a chip and PIN in the U.S. and adding that?
So that's a political battle with some of the retailers, and yeah, the chip and signature doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. The PIN actually helps with the encryption, especially if you're looking at point-to-point encryption. It's sort of similar how like the PIN codes work for your ATM card or using your debit card. And that's sort of a battle that's happening within the industry versus the banks right now. I think they're doing chip and signature to start. But it's really frustrating. It's like if you're going to do chip and pin, do chip and pin. Don't do this half-assed thing. And that's why we keep running into these sorts of hurdles and these troubles with getting compromised. Hackers are aware of that. They're going to find vulnerabilities. They're going to find ways of taking advantage of it. So right now it's a battle with the industry. Okay, and I think I'm done. If you have any questions, I'm going to be around for the next couple of days. So thank you.